This program was made possible by a grant from S.R. Foxley and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you wish to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below. Okay, now first off, what the f*** is this?
Bob's Ghana, whichever will it be. Sit the f*** down, T-Series, I'm here to spill the real tea.
And second, last week Elijah Davalos told about a classroom debate in which he proposed removing the words "under God" from the Pledge of Allegiance. The link to his video is in the description box. Now you might be wondering, why is POZ mentioning this small YouTuber again when he already shouted him out just a couple months ago? Well, my reasons aren't that complicated. It's because it was an interesting video and it illustrated something I was already going to talk about. Now, taking "under God" out of the pledge may sound like a drastic move to a lot of people. But as anybody who's even semi-informed on this topic could tell you, those two words weren't even in the original pledge to begin with. Our Pledge of Allegiance was written in 1892, yet the words "under God" were not added until 1954, which means the pledge somehow managed to survive 62 years, almost half its life so far, without making the slightest reference to God. So while I'm sure a lot of people think the Founding Fathers would be rolling in their graves at the thought of us taking God out of the Pledge of Allegiance, even though they were dead by the time it was written, we are just talking about removing a couple words that were awkwardly wedged in during the Cold War. But that has practically nothing to do with this video, except that it shows off the depth of my knowledge or my access to Google, and demonstrates that many Christians who think they're defending long-standing American traditions are really just falling for calculated and embarrassingly recent political gestures. That's something worth keeping in the back of our minds as we discuss this. But anyway,
Put the 10 Commandments back! You ain't taking my 10 Commandments!
now where this really gets interesting is when we back up from the flag issue and look more broadly at why these students were defending the words "under God." When Elijah pointed out how obviously problematic it is to have kids recite things about God in public schools, this is what they said.
But they argued, again, oh, you don't have to say it. You know, you could step out, you could sit down, you don't have to participate. I mean, you could stand up, you could say the Pledge of Allegiance and not just say God.
So basically, if a government institution instructs all school kids, regardless of their faith or lack of faith, to chant that our nation is a nation under God, that's okay because they're not making them participate. All they're doing is putting them on the spot to choose between that and taking a public anti-Christian stand in front of their classmates or teachers. Or just keeping their mouths shut and playing along, because that's a cool option. Of course, people also tried, "it doesn't make any difference, so why bother?" and kept changing the subject by saying it would be impractical because we'd also have to take "In God We Trust" off money. Now pause for a moment and look at just how absurd all these arguments are. Of course, this was just a class discussion, so I'm not claiming these are the best pro-under God arguments anyone's ever come up with, though they're probably close to it. But regardless, this brings up an interesting question. If the goal was to thoughtfully consider how people of different faiths can fairly interact in the same classroom, why was this class scraping so low for such obviously desperate ways to rationalize the current practice? And the answer is simple. That wasn't their goal. The plain fact of the matter is they weren't even trying to reasonably apply First Amendment principles to this situation. They were just making a bald-faced post hoc justification for promoting their religion in the classroom. Because let's be real, everybody's perfectly clear about which God the pledge is talking about, and to show just how obvious this is, all we'd have to do is picture how they'd react if this conversation were about any other God. For example, what if the debate were about keeping a reference to Allah in the pledge? Would they think that was okay? And would they think that a state-sanctioned chant that we're a nation under Allah was acceptable as long as they could choose to opt out? No. It's pretty obvious that they would instantly, conclusively, and emphatically reverse their opinion. And they'd immediately find all these same arguments to be ridiculous and lazy. This illustrates the key issue with this debate, and that is that students needed to know which religion was being given consideration before deciding which side of the argument they were going to come down on, which is a clear-cut sign that they were not only in the wrong, but were being bullies. To illustrate why, I'd like to paraphrase what Matt Dillahunty said about designing a society. He basically said that if you were constructing a new society from scratch, the best way to ensure it was fair and humane would be to set it up as if you would eventually be born into it, but you didn't know what role you would play. For example, if you didn't know what race or gender you'd be, you'd probably be very careful not to create racist or sexist policies. If you didn't know whether you'd be born into wealth or poverty, you'd probably put a lot of effort into making sure fair wages and good social programs were in place. That's why this is such a good safeguard. Because even if you were the kind of asshole who would think of a rule saying men should own their wives and be able to beat them, this scenario would make you want to pause and think, well, wait, would I be a man or a woman in this society? If you have to ask this question about a rule, then it obviously creates advantaged and disadvantaged classes of people. And if anybody insists on knowing which role they're going to play in society before they set a rule, that's a good sign they're trying to bully others. Thus, if a Christian looks at a potential law and needs to ask which religion is being given consideration before supporting it, they're almost certainly trying to be bullies. This was clearly the case with the Pledge of Allegiance issue, where many Christians would certainly need to know whether we were referring to Allah or God before deciding where they stood. But this question is vital to Christians on a shocking number of other issues. For example, should public schools conduct prayers in the classroom? Should a Christian baker have to make a cake for a gay wedding? Should a Christian official be allowed to refuse to certify a gay marriage? Should the government set up Christian monuments, such as crosses or the Ten Commandments, on public property? We often hear fundamentalist evangelical Christian activists offering loud and decisive answers to these questions. But the only reason they give that answer is that they're choosing the rule and their role, which means they're unfairly constructing the rule to allow themselves dominance over others. This is easily demonstrated if we turn each of these statements into a broad legal principle that does not identify which religion gets the advantage. If Christians would still answer yes to the question, then I guess that, while misguided, they're at least consistent and possibly concerned with fairness. But I don't think that would often be the case. For example, when we alter the first one to ask, should schools or teachers be allowed to conduct religious rituals in the classroom, you can bet your ass that most Christians would need to ask which religion's rituals before answering the question. Or if we were to change the second two questions to broadly ask whether anybody can refuse business or government services to somebody based on religious considerations, they would want to know which religions you were talking about. Or at least if the nuance of the question slipped past them, you know they would instantly change their tune the moment a Muslim clerk refused to certify a Christian marriage or an atheist baker refused to bake a cake for Christians, and they realized what was actually at stake. And of course, as satanic organizations have proven over and over, if we rephrase the last question to be, should the government set up religious monuments on public property, they would need to clarify whether they're Christian monuments before they answered. Now, of course, there are Christians of all types, and I know many take reasonable stances on issues like these. But whenever they engage in activism that specifically identifies or implies the role of the Christian, then just do what I did in this video. Try to rephrase them in general terms that don't identify which side is being put at an advantage or disadvantage, and if they need to ask which religion are we talking about before they answer, then it's clear they're looking to secure an advantage for themselves that they would never give to others. One of the most odious things about modern evangelical activism is the way they've brazenly co-opted language about tolerance and personal freedom, not to establish a blanket set of principles to help ensure we're all decent to each other in spite of our differences, but to prop up one-sided policies that they're happy to benefit from, but would never want to be the target of. If a Christian baker were fined for refusing to make a wedding cake for a gay couple, that could be the basis of God's Not Dead 4. But if a Christian couple were refused a wedding cake by an atheist baker, that could also be the basis of God's Not Dead 4. This irony conclusively demonstrates that the Christian right is concerned with one thing and one thing only, and that's achieving dominance of its religion over all others in a slow but steady shift toward theocracy.